Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 11th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I rely on the support of listeners just like you. If you would like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Riva Keith, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. So today I had the opportunity to chat with science journalist Rebecca Boyle. She is currently a columnist at Atlas Obscura, and she contributes to Scientific American, Quanta, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Pop Sci, Smithsonian, and a whole bunch of other publications that I'm sure you know and love as the science enthusiasts you all are. She also was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, and she's won a bunch of science writing awards, and she's had her work anthologized 3 different times in the Best American Science and Nature Writing. But this is her first book, which is very exciting. It's called Our Moon: How Earth's Celestial Companion Transformed the Planet, Guided Evolution, and Made Us Who We Are. So without any further ado, here she is, Rebecca Boyle. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm excited. We're going to be talking about your new book, Our Moon: How Earth's Celestial Companion Transformed the Planet, Guided Evolution, and Made Us Who We Are. But as I always do on the show, before we get into the kind of meat, the content of your new book, I'd love to talk a little bit about you. I know that you've been writing for quite some time across like a lot of different kind of classic science publications. And you also had your work in different anthologies like the Best American Science and Nature Writing. But is this your first book?
Yes. Yeah.
Ooh, that's exciting.
My first giant leap into this new world.
So that's a big difference between writing like features to jumping into writing like a full-length book.
Yes, it is nothing like it. And I think like I spent the first few months drafting thinking that like, oh, I can just write like 12 magazine features and it'll be fine. And it's not at all like that. It's a very different like brain space for sure.
And so how, like all in, I mean, I'm sure there was a lot of time just thinking about it and marinating on it, but all in, how much time would you say it took from like start to finish?
A long time. I mean, I will say in my defense, partly it was because I had a cross-country move a month before the pandemic, and I had a preschooler at the time who then like had no preschool. And then I got pregnant and then I had a newborn and then I had no childcare for her either. So there was a little bit of a gap year or 2 in the writing of this book. But it took me about 5 years.
Well, I mean, but that's what's so great about the freelance lifestyle, right? Is that those kinds of things can happen, and it's sometimes very feast and famine and very difficult, but it can also be, I think, in some ways, really, really freeing. So, and then since then, like you have become a columnist at Atlas Obscura, so that's like a more regular gig for you.
Yeah, so I have a regular column there. It was weekly in the summer. Now we're bi-weekly. It'll probably increase again now that the book is out and done. And I'm actually doing a few other things with them. I have a course that I'm teaching that's on the moon and our history with the moon. And then I'm also part of their Eclipse Festival that's happening in Hot Springs, Arkansas for the total eclipse here in April. And yeah, it's been nice to have kind of like a home again. I started out writing for newspapers, and that's kind of my background before I went freelance. And I've always stayed. It was a big change, from being part of an institution that was like 150 years old to being like just me. And so it's been nice to have like a sort of home in Atlas Obscura.
Yeah, for sure. And so you're a science writer. Did you enter into this world having studied science, or were you kind of the classic J school path and then you discovered your love for science?
It was kind of both. Like I have a lifelong love of science. And I mean, I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid. I went to space camp, I thought about applying to the Air Force Academy. And then I decided I didn't want to be in the military. And I learned that that's how a lot of people become astronauts. And I was like, oh, I don't know about that. And then I studied history in college, actually, because that's just also my other lifelong interest. And then I got a job at the school newspaper and then went that route and got a job at a daily newspaper after that, covered politics for a while, and then, but never stopped being interested in science. Like I'd kind of like convinced my editor to let me write a science story where it was like, oh, there's going to be this like bill in the state legislature about like, electric car batteries or some like tax rebate, which is like, oh, that's a policy story. But no, I'm going to go visit the National Renewable Energy Lab and write about battery science, So I kind of like snuck it in.
I love that.
And then when I started freelancing, that's what I gravitated to. And I just kind of never looked back.
Well, and it's interesting too to think about the crossover with your interest and love of history as well, because I think obviously some of my favorite science writing is history of science. And also that's how we understand science, is to understand how we got to know what we know now.
Yeah. And that was the most fun part of writing this book to me, was like, I got this deep dive in sort of the history of thought and how people have figured out how to figure things out, if that makes sense. Like the way that we learn how to learn and the way that we learn how to study and make sense of the universe. I just love that kind of process. And the book really kind of walks the same path. It's pretty chronological in that way, where like you come to see how humans understand things and how we come to know things.
I love that, because I feel like sometimes what we grapple with as thinking animals, right, as individuals who have a psychology to contend with, is that we know what we know now, and we're deeply biased by hindsight. And so it's very easy to sort of look back and be like, ugh, I can't believe we thought that like the earth was the center of the universe, or like, or the sun was the center of the universe. And really it's difficult to put ourselves in the mindset of who we were hundreds or thousands of years ago. And so I love that that is something that is so important for you to paint a picture of, for us to understand our relationship with the moon.
Yeah, I think one analogy I used for this in the book was like, I thought about this a lot, was I always defend the importance and the transformative power of the Beatles.
Okay.
And like, because like people think about the Beatles as being like, well, they're cool, some of their songs were catchy and stuff. But like now, like a long time after their sort of heyday, the Beatles are like old and, I think younger people might feel more this way, but like the Beatles are kind of tired, it's your grandpa's music.
Oh, how sad. I'm like, really? That's what young people think.
Yes, I hear this from like, not me, but like people younger than me. But I'm always like, but you have to remember how important they were in the context of the time. Like you only have ever heard music that was influenced by the Beatles. And to go back in time to really understand the change that happened when they came on the scene is like, it's hard to do because you only know what you know. And what you know has been influenced by their presence over music for the last 60 years, And I think of science as the same thing, where it's like, yeah, it's easy to laugh now at people like, Copernicus and Ptolemy and those people not understanding the reality of the universe, because all you've ever learned, if you live right now, is more accurate, is more truthful. And so it's hard to step out of your own shoes and really understand what happened before the knowledge that we all have. And yeah, I use the Beatles as like my example.
I love that. It's also, I think, such an inordinate privilege that we take for granted because we are living in kind of contentious times. We're seeing a lot of anti-science rhetoric. There are, public figures that are avowed flat earthers. And so we sort of, I think, take for granted that like people just don't know anymore, or they're like, so anti authoritative opinion. But the truth of the matter is the vast majority of individuals on this planet have just the privilege of having been exposed to deeply researched knowledge, and they just kind of know stuff in passing we never would have known before.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's another thing we take for granted. We have all the world's knowledge on like an 8-inch rectangle and like you take it for granted anymore, but yeah, we are very lucky to live at the time we live now where we have access to all of the knowledge and all of the foibles of the people who have come before us. And so I think it's sad when people squander that in favor of, other ideas.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, when you kind of sat down, and granted, like you mentioned, this is a very sort of long and meandering process, but when you sat down to really tell the story of our relationship with the moon and how the moon affected us and how we affected our future knowledge and, our discoveries, where do you even start? Like, how did you decide kind of what the bounds would be of what you would talk about?
I think it just kept expanding as I kept doing research, and it became much more all-encompassing than I think I intended. And initially, when I wrote the proposal for this, it was like, oh, I think I want to write an appreciation of the moon. And like, I think people take it for granted, and it doesn't get its like fair share. It doesn't get its due in astronomy and planetary science, but just in like the public consciousness. Like if people think about the moon at all, they think about like Apollo and now Artemis missions to go up there. Or maybe like, oh, it's supermoon, like it looks good on Instagram, and I really wanted it to be more like, no, the moon is really special. And then I started doing this research and became more convinced that like the moon is actually super vital to everything that's ever happened here. And the book became more like an argument that's like trying to convince you that you're here because of the moon, and all of these things that have happened because of the moon's influence over this planet, over evolution, over us, human culture. And that's kind of how it came together. I think just in terms of how the structure arose, there was a lot of back and forth with my editor, who's amazing, on just like how to present all this information that I have. The book is like pretty full of information, but I also really wanted it to be a story. And so I thought about it I tried to think about it as a reader. Like, I like reading fiction. I read a lot of fiction. And I think fiction authors are really great at storytelling, at setting up things to come later, at hinting at things, foreshadowing, at metaphor, at dialogue, all these things that we enjoy as consumers of fiction and stories, like any movie or show. I try to think like that and present the stuff that I'm trying to argue in a more like storytelling kind of structure or framework. And I think that really helped as a writer. Just like, I want people to sort of go on a journey with the moon as the main character, and the moon has these experiences and it's transformed. It follows the Joseph Campbell hero's journey. And that was like my goal, was like, this is like the kind of classic literature structure. It's in the Odyssey, it's in Star Wars, where, it's this like classic quest tale where there's a main character, a hero, who goes on a quest for knowledge or for a treasure. He's looking for the one and only ring, or, the force, and goes on this journey, encounters people who help him along the way or who hinder his experience. Then something bad happens, you find out Darth Vader's your dad or something. And there's this like sort of fall, I guess. There's an abyss that the character encounters. And then you have to come back from that and then, become triumphant. And so the moon follows that journey in the book. And I think that helps, like, as a reader, hopefully, but also as a writer, just to have this sort of framework for you're going on an adventure.
Absolutely. And it keeps you wanting to like turn the next page and turn the next page, which is so important. And I don't want to say sometimes lacking, because I think some of the best nonfiction writers do exactly what you said, but there is sometimes a quite jarring difference between fiction and nonfiction. And in the best nonfiction books, I do think that gap is closed for that very reason. You want to turn the page. You want to know what's next, because you are on a journey, and you're being taken along on this story. And so, what you ended up doing is sort of breaking the book up into 3 sections. And I think it's so important to start where you started, this idea of how the moon was made, before we get into our relationship with the moon, especially because I think when we think about the moon, we think about how we just sprung forth, right? Like we can argue all we want about how life was first formed on the planet, but by the time we were conscious beings and could look up and could recognize this thing in the sky, it had been there for like billions of years. So
forever, yeah.
Yeah, so that's like a really interesting just concept to even think about, before we were even aware of this thing that was sort of always looming and that we were grappling with and saying, what the hell is that? And why is it there? And what does it mean? It formed around the same time that our home formed. So why don't you give us a little background on that? Like, how did the moon come to be?
The fact that we don't totally know, I think is amazing. Like, I love this question that, like, how did the moon get here? And the answer is like, well, we have a few ideas, but we don't really know. And I think that's amazing, in part because, like, it's the moon. We should know, we should understand that. But it just says a lot about how unique this system is and how important the moon has been, that like it's sort of, well, it's always been there. It's like we don't really know where to begin, because you can't begin at the beginning, because the moon has always been a part of Earth. It's always existed. It's always been a part of who we are. And we've learned a lot about how this probably went down, mostly through Apollo rocks and now really sophisticated computer modeling. So we think that there was some titanic collision between early Earth and another protoplanet, which we named Theia, which is the mother of the moon in Greek mythology. And they would have combined completely, is the most likely story, that like somehow Theia came in, smacked into Earth. Both planets are totally obliterated. There's no crater of this at all. It's like they're both vaporized, essentially. And somehow in the following century, 100 years, like a century, the result is these 2 worlds, the Earth and the moon that we have now. But there's still a lot of debate. It's incredibly short. Like, the most recent supercomputer simulations of this event suggest that it was like on the order of like 100 to like maybe 1,000 years, which in cosmic time is like less than an eye blink. Like, that's amazing to me that this happened so quickly. But we don't really understand, we don't totally know how planets themselves are formed. We have some good theories, but we don't really understand the process in its entirety. And I think that's the case for the moon too. We don't really know exactly how it happened. There's still a lot of really interesting and competing ideas about what that looked like and how long it took, which I think is just fun.
And it's interesting because I feel like we cannot help but be these sort of anthropocentric beings, right? Like, by definition, we are human, so we are human-centered. And I don't know if this is a classic example of anthropomorphism, but when we think of the moon, it's like, well, Earth is home, and Earth is dynamic, and Earth has oceans, and Earth has an atmosphere. And then it's like, but the moon is this like cold rock that just satellites us, and it's sort of like the moon was made to be surrounding us, as opposed to the fact that these are sort of 2 worlds that are enmeshed really deeply. And it's like we can't kind of separate that centrism from the story.
Yeah, we always think about it from our point of view, and I think that's one thing I wanted to do with this book, is like center the moon's point of view.
Yeah.
And like, what would it be like to be up there? And what would it be like to be it? And, have borne witness to the whole history of Earth and all the things that have happened on this planet, which is the only planet we know has life. That's incredible. And yeah, I think, it does raise questions about the whole anthropic principle. Like, we are here because this planet is hospitable to life, because all these conditions exist, and therefore these conditions must be important for life to exist because we are here to observe it. Like, it's this kind of recursive logic. But I think the moon is probably a big player in that. And I don't think it gets enough credit sometimes for shepherding all of human existence.
Yeah, so then that takes us to sort of the next section of the book, how the moon made us. So I would love maybe if you could share with us some examples, especially things that we might not know. I think a lot of people, as opposed to, God, who was it? The tides come in, the tides come out. You can't explain that. Who said that on Fox News? I can't remember.
Oh my God,
idiotic.
I don't know.
I know I'm blanking. But it was idiotic. Like I think a lot of people kind of do know, okay, there's a relationship between the tides and the moon is responsible for but they don't. And then there's sort of the pseudoscientific stuff that comes out from like, ooh, the moon and like my menstrual cycle, or like the moon and my psychology, and these cycles of like howling at the moon. But the real relationship between the moon and the earth is one that is incredibly dynamic and, as you said, essential. So maybe you can shed light for us on some of the things we might not know, or maybe even debunk some of the things we think we know.
Yeah. Well, the thing I was, I think, most surprised by when I first started researching this was just that the tide is like so much more complicated than you think. It's basically all a lie, what you've been told. That like, oh, the tide is like, you're on the beach and you have a beach towel and now you have to move it because the tide's coming in. That's like how most people experience the tide, if we experience it at all. It's so much more profound than that. It's almost this like violent thrashing. Like the whole planet is like sloshing around every day. And the moon is too, and it has an effect on the length of our day. Like Earth's rotation is slowing down over time because of the tide, and it's just so much more profound than the movement of water. And I don't think people really fully appreciate the role that has played in everything from geology to the evolution of life. Like I wanted to write about how the moon would have influenced tides in the past and what that kind of means. And I kind of came to understand that it's really played a fundamental role in probably, if not the origin of life itself, but like fostering the complexity of early life and its evolution in the oceans, and even bringing our backboned ancestors onto land for the first time. So we don't really know
because
how,
of the energy, like it literally, like we needed that energy to be able to.
So it's twofold. So yeah, partly
Okay.
it's the energy. So like more than half of the energy of ocean mixing. So like imagine the entire ocean's like stirring around throughout the day. Is more than half of the energy required to do that is from the tide, the lunar tide. And so if you don't have that influence, all of these nutrients in the sea column, the water columns in the ocean just sink to the floor where like they can't be used by the chain of marine life, And if wherever life first originated, we don't know where exactly that happened. It could have been in warm little pools, which is what Darwin called them, like tidal pools at the water's edge. Or it could have been in these mid-ocean ridges where there's this interesting mixture of like chemistry and minerals and heat coming from these rifts in the seafloor into the water. The moon would have dragged those things up and exposed them to the sun for the first time and created, the possibility for them to evolve and to flourish. And then, a few billion years after that first happened, the moon is probably what drags vertebrates onto shore. And this is actually super recent research that is really intuitive if you think about it. Like, of course, the tide is going to play a role in like fish moving in and out of water. They're going to get stranded, but it's only in the last few years that people have made this connection through the paleontological record. And people have looked at ancient bathymetry, like looking at modeling the ancient seafloor and ancient coastlines to see what land masses would have looked like when the moon was closer. And it turns out that the tidal cycles that were happening in the Devonian period, so the age of fishes when vertebrates first emerge onto land, the moon is a lot closer then because it's 350 million years ago. So the tide is more powerful. The day is actually shorter than it is now by like a couple hours. And if you look in the land masses where we know there were really extreme tidal cycles, there are fossil records of vertebrates coming onto land for the first time. And so the moon plays a role in this. And it makes sense. Like think about if you're a bony fish, you have like beefy limbs and bony arms, what become arms in later animals. or, four legs, you have to, and you're in a shallow habitat, where you have evolved. And this is a time where the tide is coming in and out at like 80 feet of water between high and low tide is the differential. So it's really extreme. Like water is rushing in and rushing out. And if you're a fish, you better either get out of there or learn to breathe the air and move your body across the sand instead of just through the water. And that's what happened. And I think we have not fully understood or appreciated the role the moon itself plays in that. Like, it wasn't like fish decided to just like hang out on land,
Right.
I think it's probably, I mean, there maybe is some like, there's an environmental pressure, which is the most powerful evolutionary pressure. It's surely there were probably some that were like, oh, there's more food over there. I'm going to like go in that area and forage, and like, oh, look, plants have come onto land too in the Devonian. So I'm going to go eat those. That's possible for sure. But like, I also think it's very possible that they wouldn't have ended up beached on land if the tide didn't put them there.
Oh, that's fascinating. So like, obviously there were no people around, so there was no surfing yet, but surfing would have been insane back then.
Yeah.
So
would have been terrifying.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting to think, because again, we come back to this like anthropic kind of thing where like everything that is because it's how we engage with it, which is just not true. But the way that things are feels so permanent. But it's not. It's very static. We are just looking at a very specific slice of geologic or cosmic time. So the way that things are now is not how they used to be, and it's not potentially how they will be in the future. I'm curious, I know this is jumping around a little bit, but given that sort of evolution where the moon was closer, where we're seeing sort of the like Tiktaalik who's coming, and starting the journey to become these like land-dwelling walking animals, where are we going? Like, obviously, if things were different before, they're going to be different in the future. And, you can't sort of be tasked with telling where the human, species is going to be. But like, where's the moon going to be? And how will things change on Earth?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to answer that. And one is that the moon is like leaving, the moon is receding from us. So at some point in the distant future, it will no longer have as powerful an effect on our planet. Its gravity will be weaker, and so it will have a weakened effect on the tide, and even on things like the stability of the axial tilt of Earth over millennia. So the Earth's axis might wobble a lot more than it does already, which would be a really interesting in terms of climate. How would if our planet is suddenly tilted at 40 degrees to the sun as opposed to 23.5 degrees, then what would that do to the seasons? What would that do to the ice caps and the poles? And there would be huge effects on Earth's climate as a result of the recession of the moon. And that's like a long way away. We don't have to worry about that. But then in terms of the future of the moon itself, I think that's a really pressing question right now. I mean, we're going back up there. We just had the first ever commercial lunar lander make it up there. It tipped over, so it wasn't like a total complete success, but it's a big success in many ways, in that like a privately funded, commercially funded spacecraft landed on the moon for the first time. Japan just landed up there a month or so ago, becoming the 5th country to do so. And China's going back probably this year with another rover. The US wants to send astronauts back, by the end of this decade. We'll see how well that goes, how quickly that actually happens. But there's a lot of interest on the moon right now, and a lot of people with their sights on it. So I think it's an interesting time to think about how we use it and what it means to us. And I want people to reflect on that. I hope if there's one like upshot of the book, it's like, what do we owe the moon? After this whole history, after this shepherding of our entire culture, and every civilization on this planet has used it in some way and to profound effect. Are we really just going to like go and strip mine it? Like, I want people to be a little more thoughtful about how we use it in the future. And I think that's the time for that is like right now.
I think that's such an important point. And it's something I grapple with an awful lot, because the other show that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, it's like me and these 4 guys who are a little bit older. They're all Connecticut, educated, white, and they have a very sort of techno-optimistic. They're from a certain era, right, where space exploration, where the first time that we landed on the moon was this, and it still is, but I mean, like, this huge accomplishment. But one of the things I often grapple with are the ethics, and I think sometimes my use of terminology like extraction or colonialism doesn't quite land, because the argument is always like, well, but there's no people there. So it's different than, like, a lot of people are like, I get it, this like explorer mentality, this colonial mentality, but like that has to do with, going into places where there's indigenous people and like fucking it up. But no, I think the same principle applies. And I struggle sometimes to communicate those things. How do you feel about that? I'm hearing a lot of yeses.
I think, no, I totally agree. And I mean, I think it's like super, I don't know, problematic is its own problematic word. It's kind of a loaded word anymore. But like, I have a lot of issues with how people talk about lunar exploration right now. And it's always like glazed in this sort of capitalist, colonialist Western expansion mythos that I find to be really troubling in a lot of ways. I think, we really should be learning more lessons about the past on this planet and how we've treated one another, but also how we've treated our natural resources. One thing that does seem to get through to people, for me anyway, is like, I point out, and I think people are shocked to hear this sometimes, that like anything we do to the moon, we'll be doing it permanently. There's no cycle of erosion, or there are no plate tectonics, there's no wind, there's no rain, there's no tide coming ashore to wash away anything we do up there, which I think is a big responsibility to future generations of people who want to go to the moon too, or just live here beside it. And I think that's surprising to people because Earth is going to be okay. Like, I hesitate to say that as somebody who cares about climate change and the way that we treat this planet, but like, Earth as a system is going to be fine. We might not be, right. Other animals that evolved here with us might not be, but like
Earth itself is so resilient.
Yeah, this planet has been through a lot. The life on this planet has been through a lot and has withstood these mass extinction events that happen mostly because of the carbon cycle, actually, not just rocks from space. That's the most famous extinction event, the KT event, where the dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteor. But like the other mass extinctions that have happened on this planet have happened because of carbon dioxide and the carbon cycle changing the atmosphere and choking things to death or freezing it completely. So, I mean, Earth as a system will be fine despite us, but the moon doesn't have any way to recover. That's a, natural recovery the way that Earth has. And I mean, I hear a lot about in the climate movement right now about the idea of being a good ancestor and stewarding what we have on Earth for future generations of people and other forms of life. But I think we need to think about that in terms of the moon as well. Like, we need to be a good ancestor for future generations of lunar explorers or people who just care about it, who live here next to it and want it to be protected in some way or have to continue the meaning it has had over us into the future. I think we need to be thoughtful about how we use it.
Yeah. And also, I think we don't often think about the geopolitics involved. Like, we as a global society are so factioned. Like, we don't have a global government. We don't have a global, like a unified global society. And so the moon is yet sort of, sadly, another quote unquote frontier for conflict as well. And I think we're already starting to see that. Usually the firsts of something, right? The first lunar lander, the first footsteps on the moon, these are like huge accomplishments and the entire globe kind of celebrates them. But soon, when people are competing for those resources or those statuses or those sadly, resources I mentioned, if we are talking about these extractive practices, now all of a sudden it's just like sort of another front in the war, in the capitalist war.
Yeah, that's really worrisome to me because I think that's very possible. And that's sort of what's just unfolding. I don't think there's any intent for it to be that way. Like, I hope that people are not sitting there being like, it's mine, come and get me, whatever. But like, that's going to just be how it unfolds if we don't act more thoughtfully and more deliberately in the very near future, the next couple of years, in part because of, like I said, the moon doesn't have any way to safeguard itself or to recycle itself. And so if you have a mission that's going to be putting up a telescope or something, there's a really interesting group of scientists, on Earth who really want to put a telescope on the far side of the moon, a radio observatory, because it would be a really great place to do certain types of astronomy, which include looking at the time when the first stars ignited, the cosmic dawn. There's a really interesting field of science that could use the moon for really great research. And yet, if China is up there with a rover again on the far side, if the US lands astronauts on the far side for the first time, which is a goal of Artemis, then that radio quiet zone is no longer radio quiet. And so you've inherently messed up someone else's plans just by being there. And that's more the case on the moon than anywhere on Earth. Just human presence itself is so disruptive to the natural state of things that you're having an effect on other people inherently just by being there.
Yeah, we think it's bad here with let's say light pollution is a good example, or satellites, to kind of destroy quote unquote our astronomy. But you think it's bad here, but that would be so much worse.
It would be really destructive in fundamental ways. Certain things would not be able to happen, and the same is true for just a small science station. So imagine, or just the artifacts that are already up there. If you want to think about protecting the Apollo landing sites as part of human heritage, the way the UN, notes the, heritage sites of ancient humanity, then you can't land anything else in the Sea of Tranquility, because any landing on the moon requires retro rocket braking because there's no atmosphere to slow you down. So you have to fire these rockets that kick up enormous amounts of dust, which goes into orbit essentially because there's less gravity on the moon. And again, no atmosphere to slow things down. So you're scouring other spacecraft like a Brillo pad because lunar dust is sharp and jagged and very actually dangerous. And so if you're going to the moon back and forth, any location on the moon is going to be disrupted by that, which is also something I don't think people think about very much, in terms of the global effect that we could have on the moon just by being on it. And I don't want people to think that I don't want to do that. I think being on the moon is really important. Actually, I think it's super valuable, but I don't think people are thinking about some of these, after effects of our exploration efforts. And I hope people do start talking about them because, like you said, there's no international body in charge. There's really nobody in charge. It's just the spacefaring countries have to figure out how to do this in a peaceable way. And I hope that we can.
And do it sort of, like you said, preemptively. I keep coming back to space junk, right? This idea that for years and years and years, we've just been putting satellites up around the Earth being okay, this has a cool purpose. And then once it doesn't work anymore, whoopsiekins. We haven't really, but now we're starting to think, okay, can this be something that once its lifespan is over, it falls back down? Is it something that can be decommissioned so that we're not adding to the junk problem, which as we know, junk hits junk and makes more junk. And so there are ways to go about these things with a little bit of forethought and just, thinking about all of the intended and the unintended consequences. Obviously, we're never going to know the unknown unknowns, but we can be, I think, a little more thoughtful and have a little more foresight than we've kind of historically had.
Yeah, I mean, certainly more than we've had on this planet. And I hope more than we have had so far with respect to the moon. And I think there are ways to do it. The Artemis Accords are one kind of avenue for this, at least is a start. This is a NASA program that's kind of like a pseudo treaty. There's the Outer Space Treaty, which dates to the Cold War, and it's from 1967, and it is pretty vague, and it just says things like nobody can militarize space or use it to launch nukes. But there's not a lot of other really good guidelines embedded in this treaty. And so the Artemis Accords is a NASA effort that asks all the other spacefaring countries or, the ones that hope to be spacefaring countries to agree to a certain set of parameters where it's okay, we agree that we'll help each other out in emergencies. If your spacecraft breaks and you need a ride home, somebody who can give you a ride home should do that. Or no one is allowed to like mess up someone else's stuff on the moon. But, just because, again, of the nature of the moon itself, like that's going to be hard to do. And so who knows how this will be actually enforced, or like there is no real, authority that can enact any regulations or any punitive, changes, like things if you do something bad, who's going to get you in trouble, like it's going to be kind of a free for all until people step back a little bit. And I do think that like the first couple of launches that we had in the early part of this year, these two first commercial lunar attempts, one of them didn't make it there at all because of a fuel issue after launch. One of them did make it there, but tipped over and didn't land the way that it was hoping to. I think it reflects that like this is still really hard and it's going to be difficult to get it right. It's still going to be really expensive. It's very dangerous. I'm kind of hopeful that that is a reminder. And it gives us some time. It allows us to kind of take a breath and be like, okay, this is happening. People are going up there. These private companies are bringing up all kinds of random things and also science experiments on behalf of NASA. Japan's up there, India, China, Russia, the US. Like now is a good time to like think about what is happening up there and maybe come together in some way. I don't even really know how that would work, but it would be probably through the UN, which we all know how slow and difficult that can be. But it's better than nothing. We need to at least have this conversation.
Yeah, because I think what our own history of quote unquote exploration here on Earth has taught us is that early on, when not many people or not many nations have the financial security or the scientific know-how to do stuff, we have these sort of independent individual experiences, and those can be dramatic, right? Like we think about, early explorers going to individuals who hadn't been reached by the West before, and sort of the really dramatic consequences of that kind of contact or that kind of colonialism. But then eventually more and more players get involved in the game. And now there's a whole new level of conflict. And I think we forget that, we act as though our relationship with space right now is how it's always going to be. But it's not. Just, again, I keep going back to space junk. Look at the satellites. Look at how many there are now, because we all kind of figured it out. Right. Once everybody figured it out, then it was a free for all. And that's when it becomes super overwhelming. That's not to say that the early contact doesn't have dramatic downstream consequences, but they're sort of isolated and singular. Once it becomes, an everyday thing, once it becomes sort of normative, then all of a sudden you're going from a little bit of trash to a giant landfill. And that's, I think, concerning.
I think it's at least something we need to be thoughtful about. And, I think one way I think about the moon in this context is to compare it to Antarctica, where it's like we've all kind of agreed as a planet that it's different, it's special, no government has owned it. There are some countries that have like claimed, territorial ownership of it based on proximity, but like that's not recognized by anybody else. There are Antarctic treaty agreements that the countries of the world have signed on to. There are international collaborations happening there. There are science stations that are like permanently occupied and people come and go. There's tourism, but there's not like a huge, like Los Angeles sized city. There are like little settlement areas where people are and services that, feed the people in the industries that are there. And, it's a different place than anywhere else on Earth. And I think that's a useful analog for how we can imagine the moon, where it's austere, it's hard to get there, it's difficult to be there. You better have a lot of preparation and training and equipment and probably money, or like the backing of, an agency that's funded well by some government somewhere, and, be ready for what comes. And I think the moon is the same as Antarctica in that regard. So that might be a way to think about it going forward.
That is and there's sort of like a built-in reverence that comes with the fact that it's not easy, And I think
it's not.
It's not like Antarctica is on our own planet and it's not easy.
Yeah,
and I think sometimes
it's hard.
Like people with that colonial mindset forget that sort of like,
yes,
we can't even terraform our own planet that well to make it habitable. Like, can you imagine?
Right.
Like, we might have a couple little colonies or something, but we're not going to be living on the moon the way we live here. It's just not possible.
No way. It's not possible. And we didn't evolve for that. We weren't built for that. And the moon wasn't built for us. It's not that simple. And I think, having respect for that fact does kind of build in some reverence for the experience and for the austerity and difficulty of those attempts. People think, I hear sometimes just talking about this book in the last couple of months, people are like, oh, well, we went to the moon like half century ago. Like, why are we not back already? And my answer is often, well, it's still hard.
Right.
The physics hasn't changed. Like, sure, we have more advanced rockets now and better spacecraft guidance systems, but like we literally just crashed up there, a week ago. Like, it's still difficult because it's just physically hard to do. It's hard to get enough energy to leave Earth's gravity well, go across this incredible distance. The moon's really far away. I think people don't realize it's like you could fit 30 Earths between Earth and the moon. It's very, very far. So it takes a long time to get there, even at rocket speeds, like incredibly high speeds. And then you need to slow down to a complete stop like a couple days later and bring an entire house with you to survive.
Right.
Like, it's just hard, and it's going to be hard forever. And I think people take that, we take the ease of it for granted. We've I don't know, we all read too much science fiction, I guess.
Well, we're also just living in a culture and a society where technology becomes, like, again, like you said, we take it for granted. Like, our iPhones are still hard. Like, just because they're user friendly doesn't mean that the technology that went into making them and updating them isn't really hard. And I think just because we can use it doesn't mean that most people would be able to fix it or would understand how to make it work. And it's the same thing when we think about getting to the moon. Just because we did it a long time ago, first of all, we were lucky. Like, that's not to say that the work that went into it wasn't incredible, but like the fact that lots of people didn't die in that process is kind of like amazing.
It is.
We were very lucky. And we were also prioritizing it from a militaristic viewpoint. Like, this was the thing that mattered to Americans, more than anything else at the time. But like, it's still, like you said, it's still and will always be really hard. And just because it's doable, it's like once we've done something. I remember there was an old Louis C.K., and I hate to even bring his name up, but there was an old Louis C.K. stand-up about like the Wi-Fi going out on the plane the first time it was ever available. And the guy being like, oh,
I know you're,
yeah, you know what I'm talking. Yeah,
and
like I've been like, how can you take for like you literally just experienced this for the first time 5 minutes ago, and you're already annoyed that it's not
tube,
exactly. And I think we do that. It's such a maybe it's not a human thing, but it's definitely an American thing to like just be like, oh, I deserve this technology. It's like,
where is my flying car? Like,
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So
we all take it for granted.
Seriously, and I think that that's such an important. It's an important message in your book among so many others. And so I know I'm keeping this super short and sweet today because, because of a lot of things. But I'm super grateful for you to spend time with us today, Rebecca. And I'm curious, just right here before we end, obviously there's a million things in here that we didn't talk about, but is there any like big takeaway or something that you would be remiss if we didn't mention it before we close out the interview?
I think my favorite thing that I was surprised by myself is the sort of deeper connection that I ever realized between religion and science. And I think the moon is really the bridge between them in a way that I never appreciated until this, where I feel like people use the moon for timekeeping initially. That's like the way we first kind of discovered how to make use of it. And that transforms fairly soon into this devotion. Like, people are worshiping the moon. And because of these devotional practices, which arise in the first literate societies in Mesopotamia, like now what's now Iraq and parts of Syria and Iran and the Levant, the cradle of civilization, people create these really detailed records of where the moon is and where the planets are and the rising and setting times for all these like astrological purposes. And spiritual and even like superstitious purposes, but they create this record of data that is used by the Greeks and the Romans and even into the Enlightenment for people to figure out the nature of reality and to invent what we think of as modern Western science. And I never really knew that before I wrote this book. And I think that's just super compelling to me, that like this connection between things that people are taught are very disparate and, and very distinct from each other, actually have more in common than we might think they do.
It's interesting. And it's this universal, very humanistic drive to find answers. And I think whether it's through religion or science, or even I see it within the sciences, right? I come from psychology and I'm very existentially oriented in the clinical psychology work that I do. But I have friends like Sean Carroll comes to mind, who's a theoretical physicist, but we're both talking about the nature of reality and why are we here and what does it mean for us and what's our relationship to existence. And religion does the same thing, right? Historically and even now. It's trying to explain our place in all of this.
I mean, Carl Sagan said this, that they're both just different ways of trying to understand the universe. And I don't think that one is necessarily superior to the other. But I more think now that like they're actually more related than I ever realized. And I just find that to be really interesting. And that conflict that we always have among them is maybe not really as true as I thought.
And I love that too, because it shows this sort of other side of the coin, like your kind of investigative historical work. It's so easy for us to say, well, as scientists, and that explains this religious view. But you're sort of showing the other side of that. No, those religious experiences or those religious investigations actually helped forge the science. Like they are explaining what we now know, which is really cool.
Yeah, and they may not have been intending to do that. Like that wasn't why they like set out to write these like, clay tablets full of data. Right. But that's still that was the result, and I think that's interesting. I think we should be more grateful to that legacy maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, gosh, everybody, the book is Our Moon, How Earth's Celestial Companion Transformed the Planet, Guided Evolution, and Made Us Who We Are by Rebecca Boyle. Rebecca, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and enlightening us to these kind of things that I don't think we often think about. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk movie.